This instructional video is about the basics of photography. In the next few minutes, I'll be telling you how to adjust your camera settings to get the correct exposure and your desired result. By the end of this video, you should have a good understanding of the basics of photography, and you should be able to apply the following skills. Number 1, understand the exposure triangle. Number 2, change your aperture setting. Number 3, change your shutter speed. Number 4, change your ISO setting. And number 5, adjust various settings to affect depth of field, freeze or blur motion, and use existing light. The quickest way to ruin a good image is to expose it poorly. There are 3 factors you should consider before taking a single photograph. These are shutter speed, aperture, and ISO. The combination of these 3 factors is called the exposure triangle, and all 3 of them have to be in balance in order to get the correct exposure. Apertures, or f-stops, can be identified by numbers. Each of these numbers corresponds with the size of a lens opening that allows light to reach the film or digital media in the back of your camera.
An aperture in a lens is basically like the pupil of your eye. Outside on a bright day, you'll notice people's pupils are very small. This is due to the fact that your eye is adjusting to the light outside. Now when you're indoors in a darker environment, your pupils are very large and try to take in more light. Now this is the exact way the aperture of a lens works. The more light, the more you need to close down your aperture to allow less light in. Opposite of that, the less light there is, you're going to need to open up your aperture in order to let more light into your lens.
The second factor in the exposure triangle is shutter speed. Shutter speed controls the amount of time that the volume of light coming through your lens is allowed to stay on the film or digital media in your camera.
For most cameras, shutter speed is displayed as whole numbers, which in actuality are really fractions. For example, a number such as 60 in the viewfinder or on the LCD is really 1/60th of a second. Slower shutter speeds will display quotation marks, which indicate a measure in seconds. Let's look at 2 shutter speeds in real time. This would be a shutter speed of 1/30th of a second. And this is a shutter speed of 2 seconds. Now, there are a few important barriers to keep in mind when considering shutter speed. The first is 1/60th of a second. If you are shooting people, this is usually the safe barrier. Anything slower than 1/60th of a second will increase the chance that it will be blurry. And the reason is people move. You move, and your subject may move. If you are attempting to take handheld pictures at shutter speeds slower than 1/50th of a second, without a tripod or without an image stabilized lens, you are probably kidding yourself, and you're probably wasting your time. So keep that in mind when you're shooting people, 1/60th of a second. If you're shooting a moving athlete, usually 1/500th of a second will be enough to freeze the action. It really depends on what you're trying to do, but for beginners, keep this in mind, 1/500th of a second for moving athletes.
The last factor in the exposure triangle is ISO. ISO stands for International Standards Organization, and it refers to the industry norm for sensitivity of emulsion-based film.
Here is a list of common ISO values on a camera. Note that not all cameras will show all of these values. Again, entry-level cameras typically have less ISO choices than pro-level cameras, so don't worry if you don't have all of these values. Also, ISO can have 1/3 or 1/2 stop increments as well. So you may see values in between these common values. Just like our aperture, the difference between one ISO to the next is a difference of 1 stop. So if we go from ISO 100 to 200, we will add 1 stop of light. Going from ISO 1600 to 800, you're subtracting 1 stop of light. If you're shooting in bright lighting conditions, you will typically want to use the lowest ISO possible. Back to our football example, we used a low ISO to make the camera less sensitive to the bright sunny conditions. When you're shooting in low lighting environments, you may have to raise your ISO to make your camera more sensitive to light. In this shot, we used a high ISO to make the camera more sensitive to the small amount of existing light. Increasing your ISO comes at a price. The higher the ISO, the more noise you will see in your image. Comparing these two images at 100%, you can see that at ISO 100 the image is smooth, but at ISO 6400 you see grain and noise.
To help put everything in perspective, let's look at two photographs together. The first one is underexposed. How should I change my camera settings to adjust for the lack of light? The second photograph is overexposed. How should I change my camera settings to lessen the light coming into my camera? Understanding the exposure triangle and how to change your aperture, shutter speed, and ISO will enable you to do a lot more than just get the proper exposure. It will also allow you to control your depth of field, stop motion or show blur in your photographs, and take photographs in low light situations. There are three factors that affect depth of field. The first is the focal length of the lens. The second factor is distance between the camera and subject. The third factor is aperture setting. This is the largest factor in determining the depth of field. The first photograph demonstrates shallow depth of field. This look was achieved by getting in really close to the subject, by using a wide aperture, and by using a long focal length for my lens. The second photograph demonstrates a greater depth of field. It was taken by backing up a little bit off the subject, by using a shorter focal length lens, and by dialing down to the smallest aperture on my camera, thus creating a greater depth of field and more focus in the background areas of the photograph. This photo also illustrates shallow depth of field. It was taken by getting really close to the subject, by using a wide aperture, and by using a long focal length for my lens. This last photograph demonstrates a greater depth of field. As you can see, most of the photograph is in focus. This was achieved by using a very small aperture, a short focal length, and getting farther away from the subject. Shutter speed is good for a lot more than just controlling exposure. It can also be used to show movement in a photograph by using quick shutter speeds to stop the action or slower shutter speeds to drag out the action and create a blur in your photograph. These first two photographs show how you can freeze action by using a fast shutter speed. As you can see, she's frozen in mid-air. The second two photographs demonstrate a motion blur that is achieved by using a slow shutter speed. Instead of adjusting their camera settings when going into low light situations, many beginning photographers will simply rely on their flash to compensate for them. The problem with always relying on flash is that it can flatten your photographs, giving them a dull appearance. This first photograph was shot indoors using a flash. As you can see, all of the light values in the photograph are the same, and it created a harsh shadow behind her cheek. The second photograph was taken using only ambient light, the light coming through the window. As you can see, there's no harsh glare, no harsh shadows, and it's still beautifully lit, showing the shadows and dimensions within the background. In this video, you have learned how to control the technical aspects of your camera, such as aperture, shutter speed, and ISO. You also learned how to manipulate these settings to affect depth of field, freeze or blur motion, and use existing light. I hope you have found this instructional video useful in helping you to learn the basics of photography. I'll be posting some sources at the end if you want to go back and review more information. In the meantime, keep practicing, and don't get discouraged if your images don't turn out exactly how you want them to at first. As the famous photographer Henri Cartier-Bresson says, your first 10,000 photographs are your worst. Now go out and shoot, and remember, your best photograph is the one you haven't taken yet.
When you're looking at me